That's my understanding.
Mine keeps randomly going in and out. I don't know if that's because of Zoom or because of me somehow.
Like your picture is, Natalie?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like I didn't turn it to Lego guy.
Oh. Okay. Well, we seem to be in business. Luke, are we good on YouTube?
We are, yes. It is a little bit different than I had anticipated, but we are just fine, and we are live. Little lesson learned, but nothing that is going to prevent us from a solid viewing. So we are all good. I will get any comments that come through YouTube and put them into the chat section in here when we get to the Q&A.
Awesome. Luke, I admire your approach to challenges, that they are obstacles that are easily overcome for the most part.
And Jenny, I was going to say, thinking about a brief passage about Ortelius's first map of Iceland as an opener. There's a section about herring. So much information about herring. And if a good place to fit it in or a time to close, the really short one about the Museum of Obligation and Samuel Jonsson making work for a church that gets rejected.
I love it. I love it. Okay. Yeah, I will just follow your lead and we'll go where we go. So I think we've got 6 people attending.
Oh, hey.
I should like act like I know how to do a webinar instead of just being really obvious that I don't know how to do a webinar. 7 attendees now. I'm gonna stop keeping track. So I propose that we chill out till like 7:35 or 7:40 or something like that, and then we'll dive in.
Jenny, as we approach the Q&A section, I will go in and allow everybody to speak.
Okay.
And here, in that way, they can have their open dialogue.
Okay.
For that part.
That is awesome. And anybody who's already here and can hear it, if you have questions or stuff you want to say, go ahead and put it in the chat before we open up the Q&A. Well, Kendra, before we formally introduce you and like get started with stuff, do you have any cool things to show us, Jenny, in your background right now?
I've got a couple cool things to show you.
What was the thing that I wrote down earlier?
That you're going to remember, you're going to come across later and wonder what a ghost stone is?
Ghost stone. Would you just tell us what a ghost stone is?
Well, first I need to tell you that if you have a mental image of Iceland, which obviously at all times you are holding in your head, if you don't, it's a thing that's shaped like that. And you should know that the eastern edge and this antler of land called the Vestfjords, those are the oldest parts of this island. The North American and the European, Eurasian tectonic plate kind of cuts through here, right? This is an island that exists because of volcanoes, right? Because of these plates pressed up against each other, right? They got a new island in the 60s, like they watched it happen over a few years, and only scientists are allowed to go there because they're studying how life establishes itself, which turns out to be much more of a rapid process than they had ever thought before. So I just need you to understand that geologically speaking, this is a very new and a very interesting place. Mm-hmm. And one of the formations, one of the things that you can make with all that pressure are what are called ghost stones.
What?
Now they vary, like you can sort of see my finger through it a little bit. They vary in opacity. I love these ones that get little like hunks of green in them. And sometimes they are downright opaque, right? This is still a ghost stone, which you know because it's the shape of a ghost.
Is that legitimately why they're ghost stones, because of the shape, or because of the shape and the general opacity?
General opacity. I think I find it really helpful to remember that Iceland is the kind of place where, like, pretty much every other person, right? If you were just to, ask somebody at the cafe, you have a really good chance that someone would tell you a ghost story, right? A personal thing that they experienced kind of ghost story. But this is also a place where sea monster stories are taboo, right? See a monster and you might be crazy, right? There are the lines of what we do and do not see. And just the landscape of it, right, suggests that all of this mist, right, this marine layer, a lot of the times, the fact that whether or not you can see the northern lights is less a question of the actual activity and more a question of, can you break through the cloud cover to know that that is happening in the sky? That being able to know where you are, being able to believe in what is there when you can't see it, is sort of a founding principle of being on this island.
Oh, wow. That's okay. That's super interesting. I have a ton of questions for you. Not the least of which is how often you approached someone in a coffee shop in Iceland and asked them a question that led to a ghost story, but we will get to that. It's 7:35. Should we go ahead and like dive formally in?
Lead on, Jenny, lead on.
Okay, so thank you to everybody who's joining us for Eastern Washington University's first visiting writer of our MFA program's Visiting Writer Series this year. We are so lucky to have a Kendra Greene with us. I will refer to her as Kendra. And before we get into her reading tonight, which will be followed by questions and potentially answers, depending on the questions, there are a few things I would like to say about Kendra. Okay, so most of the people here probably are familiar at least a little bit with Kendra's resume and her publication history and her sort of all manner of cool stuff that she's got going on, with particularly her most recent book, The Museum of Whales You Will Never See, which if anybody hasn't listened to the Spokane Public Radio interview with Kendra from yesterday, you can find that online. I want to talk about things a little bit more cerebrally. So, because Kendra Greene's work interrogates the relationship between object and story, as she talked about in that radio interview, which I super highly recommend, it seems to me that the most responsible way to introduce her to you is not by way of detailing her enormously accomplished publication history, including her new book, The Museum of Whales You Will Never See, which tours Iceland's very large number of very small museums and has been lauded as charming, delightful, whimsical, enchanted by outlets from Publishers Weekly to the Star Tribune to Granta, or by way of talking about her bookmaking, insofar as she has broadsides held in special collections at institutions like Yale and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and made a poster that I've had hanging on my fridge for the better part of a decade, or her in-demandedness as a speaker, as evidenced by her recent events with Penn and Harvard's Meta Lab, or her history of fellowships and writer in residencies and MFA in nonfiction from the University of Iowa. These things matter, but to contextualize Kendra as a writer the way she contextualizes in her work such extraordinary things in the world as the Icelandic Phallological Museum, which is exactly what it sounds like, it will be important to note that when I first encountered Kendra, she was the official sloth dresser for Rusty the Giant Ground Sloth, an exhibit/mascot at Iowa's Natural History Museum. It will also be important to note that Kendra is the kind of writer who has single-handedly reinvented the genre of red hair. To really get after it, it'll be important to note that Kendra has posed as a T-Rex for pictures that are available on the internet, no fewer than 20 times, I counted, in at least 3 countries and more than once at sea, and has been tagged on social media by other people who have taken pictures of T-Rex type things more than 5 times. She has posed as a moose just once, as far as I can tell. It is also important to note that Kendra is the kind of writer who may actually own a hat with Viking horns on it and has looked chic in a dress made out of balloons, and that she once made friends with a child dressed as a pancake and another child dressed as syrup. Let us not forget to note that Kendra can and does say things like, and I'm quoting here, "Pretty sure the last time I shot a bow and arrow was at a museum in Gwangju during the Chuseok holiday while wearing my blue and white hanbok, all filmed and 2 seconds aired by some TV reporters." Finally, it is extremely important to note that Kendra is the kind of writer who actually smiles while she runs turkey trots. Kendra's absurdly deep intellectual curiosity about the world is evident in all of her essaying, and I am pleased as punch to welcome her as EWU MFA's first visiting writer of the year. I hope you'll all virtually give it up for Kendra Greene. Kendra, take it away.
Jenny, I'm so lucky to be here in conversation with you. I am thrilled to be hanging out on the West Coast and virtually, right? You've got a long state. I appreciate that. But you're closer to it than we are here in Texas today. So look at us crossing time zones and everything, and thinking about an island that is near the Arctic Circle, not very close to here. Jenny, do you know where we need to go first? I was thinking that we might talk about the first complete map of Iceland, but there might be somewhere that we need to go before that.
Where's that?
When I was
I'm riveted.
I think about when I was putting this book together and thinking about the opportunity to keep sneaking things in, right? Keep letting the book do all the things that books get to, the technology of it. There's a whole sort of points of reference to orient you if you were to meet the book all by itself. I should say, it looks like this. It has shocking green end papers, and then this really wild thing. They printed it in a blue-green ink, right? All of the insides, everything in here. But instead of making sure that you know that the first Bible printed in Iceland in the Icelandic language could be had for the price of 3 cows, I think we could also, one way to get you there is to start you with the first complete map of Iceland, which is only a year different in the chronology from said Icelandic language Bible. The Icelanders are often referred to as one of the most literate nations in the world, right? This 100% literacy rate, and they achieved that universal literacy decades before anyone else in Europe. And that long legacy of storytelling comes up again and again, and is a lot of the reason why this book can exist in the first place. I thought I'd drop you in. If anyone's following along in the home game, we're on page 213 with a map. If you start with the first complete map of Iceland, Abraham Ortelius's from 1585, note that it is famous for its facts. It is so careful with its place names, its topography, that it is sometimes said only an Icelander could have made it. To be sure, Icelandic Bishop Guðrúnur Thorlaksson prepared much of its information, but Ortelius was Flemish, still known almost half a millennium later as the father of the modern atlas. And if you doubt the ability of Ortelius, geographer to the King of Spain, to see a place he never laid eyes on, then note the driftwood gathering on the edges of his Iceland, and the polar bears just White bears, in the parlance then, never landed but clustered on floats of ice in the northern sea. Note the volcano Hekla raging. Count the whales, the narwhals, the walruses, all the creatures measured in that ancient unit L, but nonetheless identifiable, even if you have never heard of this unit that is roughly the length of your forearm, even if you would draw them all differently now. We have records of monsters in Iceland as early as 1345, or even earlier, from the 6th century, if you trust Saint Brendan the Navigator, if you believe he made it from Ireland to Iceland and back. Ortelius labeled the creatures in his Iceland's waters with letters from A to Q, keyed to explanations that don't fit on the map engraving proper. It's easy to find fault. Sure, orcas don't hunger for human flesh or stand a whole day upright on their tails. We have absolutely no evidence at present that walruses sleep 12 hours a night dangling from cliffs by their tusks, but it had been the going wisdom for centuries when Ortelius printed it under letter N. Nor did he know what exactly a sperm whale was, but make no mistake, he knew we'd been carving chess pieces from their teeth. Say what you will about the sea hog or the sea cow or the sea horse. Think what you like about descriptions of whales with no teeth. Whales as big as islands, whales protecting fishermen in fights against other kinds of whales. Doubt if you must a fish covered with bristles or bones. Reject the cliff-dangling walruses, surely not there by their own efforts, but hung like Christmas ornaments by the hand of God. But Ortelius wasn't wrong about the amber-colored blobs of ambergris. Not vomit, but something like it, a cetaceous byproduct we still add to perfumes, a fixative, traces of it on your skin right now, perhaps, evaporating from your neck. Ortelius is the first person we know of who articulated a theory of continental drift, of the Americas torn away from Europe and Africa through a succession of earthquakes and floods. The division he was describing was something entirely too big, too long ago to be seen on any kind of human scale, but with or without the tools of direct observation, of having been there the whole time. The pieces fit. It was there at the edges. One had only to study their coasts. So you've arrived in Iceland. This seems important. Be prepared for homemade rhubarb jam simmering on the stove when you get invited into someone's kitchen. Be prepared for hospitality to be coffee and pancakes or waffles, no matter what time of day you might get invited in. Be prepared for amazing cream soups. Be prepared to live by the mantra as I have for about 7 trips and counting. When in doubt, find a body of hot water. If you can do that, and you can, right? There's a swimming pool in every town, even in places where the geothermic situations aren't quite right for the land to heat the water itself. A town of 200 people will still make sure that you have the chance to immerse yourself in hot water and look out into a fjord. I'm going to be taking you to visit some herring. I just wanted to take a moment before we go, spend some time with herring, to acquaint you a smidge more. It's a book that is built in little tiny essays and great big expansive essays, what are referred to not as chapters, but as cabinets and the galleries. And the cabinets are, they're sort of dark actually, right? They often are about loss. They're places of the imagination. They are sometimes, they're occasionally museums that might not exist, but the long galleries are lengthy studies of single institutions for the most part. I'm going to take you, as your docent, I'm just going to walk you right past the Phallological Museum with its collecting mission to acquire a phallic specimen of every mammal native to the country. We're going to keep going by Petra Stone Collection, the part of the country that gives us things like this, with all of its white whiskery spines. We're going to leave Sigurgir's bird collection, though this is a drawing from Lake Mivat. We are going to keep going by. I'm not going to let you stop at the second oldest museum in Iceland with its original curator who lives a stone's throw away in I've been corrected, it's not a town of 21 people. You need 50 people to have a town in Iceland. This is a someplace, that's the best translation, a someplace of 21 people. And this curator that will be 100 in April, but retired a couple of years ago, saying it was too soon. I'm taking you, my friends, to the herring. I know you came here tonight because you have a deep and abiding love of herring. And why wouldn't you want to filter for more people who share that love with you? It's an award-winning institution in Iceland, this museum, not of herring specifically, but of what's known as the herring era, this period of 65 years where the fish swimming close enough to be caught change the economic fortunes of a place that is the poorest nation in Europe for most of the 1,000 years it is inhabited. Imagine it, they talk about it as cosmopolitan, where people came to paint, there was music in the streets, women in orange aprons were cleaning and gutting the catch. Boys would come by to cart away the barrels of their work product and drop tokens down their boots that they would redeem for their wages later on. All right, think of a gold rush town. And then think of it emptied out. I've been thinking a lot, I don't know, in preparation for this event, I've been thinking a lot about the role of artists. And we won't quite get there with the herring to the fact that you have the award-winning museum, you have the museum that saves the town because of artists, because if you can show people what is possible, right, very literally, right? This is a painter who creates a vision of what is possible after a group of volunteers paint the last building left to save. If artists can show us what's possible, other people can make it happen. If you're, again, playing along in the home game, we're going to be on 149. If you didn't know you loved herring, you're in for a treat. This is from The End of the World. When we talk about herring, we give one name to 1,000 things. We mean always the jutting jaw, the spineless fins, the sleek silver bodies so likely to school in droves. But we mean also some 200 species in the Clupeidae family, and other species too, some of them relatives of the Clupeids and some just lookalikes. The lake herring, you may know, is actually a salmonid. We talk about toothed river and dwarf round and two-finned and red-eye herring, middling thread and black stripe and dog tooth and graceful. Pacific flatiron and West African pygmy, hatchet and Panama. We say herring and may mean an equatorial longfin or a white-finned wolf. There is no one herring except in the word. The word herring itself has uncertain origins, though it's tempting to derive it from the old High German, from that ancient word herri, meaning a host or a multitude, presumably for their massive schools, but a good fit too for their array, not just their throng. Herring are a lot of things. They are filter feeders. They are obligate shoalers. They are a fish of the open water. And they are a social fish. So much so, in fact, that they are rarely to be found in aquariums. Go ahead and look. They are so well adapted to life in a multitude that isolation, even a small company, leaves them fragile, both stressed out and sluggish, their hearts beating much too fast, and even the best aquarium cannot adequately accommodate their needs. And no wonder. The North Atlantic sees herring schools of some 3 billion fish. Try even to imagine that. Stand out in the open, somewhere you can look up at the sky where your vision is unimpeded, unless it is by something the scale of a skyscraper or a mountain range. Look out and try to grasp the volume of 3 billion fish. That's almost 5 cubic kilometers of herring and still what we call one school. People who live in Siglufjordur call the town the end of the world. Yes, the roads have gotten better, paved or simply laid in the first place, and the tunnels certainly help, but even now it has that superlative isolation the nickname implies. At least it does if you think in terms of land. But with respect to the wide and open sea, that same spot, that lovely north-facing fjord in the middle of the northern coast, is the beginning of everything. That is the geography that made Siglufjordur, at least in the herring era, the only place to be. In 1957, a good 54 years into the herring era, the town council of Siglufjordur was determined to have a museum. A heritage museum was their notion, and they elected a teacher, a trader, a principal, the mayor, and the town secretary to be its board. Because the idea for a museum came first, existed before there was any collection to shape it, they did not yet know in those early days exactly what kind of museum they would have. The board hired a consultant from Reykjavik, and the consultant suggested they concentrate their collection on artifacts from the fisheries of North Iceland. This consultant might have taken an interest in the town's reputation for producing particularly adept skiers, because indeed it does. He might have walked the far side of the fjord and become keen on eiderdown, its weightless warmth, that gossamer fluff the eider duck plucks from her own breast to snug her nest of eggs, and that down plucked again from the nest to fill pillows and comforters and feather mattresses after the ducklings are gone. But there was such a din of commerce. Who could look at the center of industry then and not see to its fishy core? So it was settled. And a little later that summer, the museum, a museum of the fisheries, began to collect. There are ways we like to talk about beginnings. We like Eureka. We like Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you. We like love at first sight and lightning strikes and an apple the moment it hits a head. We like the necessary, improbable flash. We really like the Big Bang. We like fate, but we like it all the more when it ignores the absolutely insurmountable and nonetheless dares to exist. And when I talk to the people who start museums, never do they talk about a moment like this. Not once. We can pinpoint the way a collection starts, the fact of the first thing, but a museum often enough has no one route. It is less discrete than continuous, less particle than wave. Its beginning is always hazy. No one thing really, unless that one thing is something amorphous, something not really suited to words, something maybe spoken of best as something like want. These people knew they wanted a museum even before they knew what kind of museum it would be. We don't know why the herring do what they do. Not really. We know a herring is more likely to have a full belly than an empty one when caught. We know they swim with their mouths open, expanded, so they might feed. We know they arrange themselves in grids when they swim, spaced neatly in accordance with the jump distance of their prey. What we don't know is how they pick their migration paths, why their routes change, why we can trace and model but not predict how they will thread their journey this year. From Siglufjordur's perspective, 1966 was a good year for herring. For the factories, it was the best, actually, the absolute peak. More herring than there had ever been. And by 1969, they were gone. Not that they'd been raptured, not that they went extinct. True, it had been an era without regulations, certainly not the way we know them now, and the technology had gotten so good, and surely the stock was overfished. But there were still herring in the world. They just weren't showing up in the waters north of Iceland, gone from Siglafjord and towns like it, though at first fugitive only from the north. It was a crisis. To be sure, it was an absolute calamity. The herring had been a rising tide and their harvest a 60-year swell, a cresting wave, and then just 2 summers after the zenith, a void. Informally, it went by the name, as if a plucky girl detective might solve it, when the herring disappeared. The Heritage Museum in Siglafjordur was, for a long time, more idea, more want than anything else. It was not exactly a thing disappeared, but it flickered in and out. Its board met 9 times in the first 9 years, and then stopped meeting at all for the next 8. All the first 2 decades of the museum had to show were a handful of meetings and a score of objects collected. Yet in those 8 years, when the board wasn't meeting, the fisheries hit their summit. And in those same years, the fisheries collapsed. In the beginning, the board thought they were making a museum of now. And before it was much of anything, it had become a museum of then. Or else it wasn't anything at all, really, except for a collection of 28 objects stored in 3 buildings across town, a collection tucked away like a hope chest. A collection of fish gathered together is called an aggregation. They need have no shared purpose. Indeed, an unstructured aggregation has a random quality, with any number of species and sizes of fish sharing one location, but otherwise acting without relation to one another. If that aggregation has a social dimension, if its fish relate in an interactive way, they are said to be shoaling. You may know the noun shoal for its landform meaning. Those ridges and bars and banks just above water or barely submerged. And it's the same word for these other formations in the sea, except with fish instead of grains of sand. Half of fish species shoal at some point in their goings-on, and a quarter shoal all their lives. If the shoal is organized, if its members are synchronized swimmers moving at the same speed and in the same direction, identical vectors, only then are they said to be schooling. Schooling fish tend towards homogeny, are generally assemblies of the same species and, more to the point, fish of the same size and shape and coloring. We don't know the exact reason for this rampant, unyielding conformity, but the oddity effect proposes it comes about because predators have an easier time targeting any fish in a group that is not like the others. Standing out goes against survival. And while you might assume a certain macabre utility in having a sacrificial lamb at the ready, really, it's better for everyone, except I suppose the predator, to attract as little attention as possible. The oddity effect also means that the juvenile herring, being smaller than their parents, form different schools than the mature fish, ever keeping like with like. Indeed, in their earliest stages, herring are largely transparent. They are a floating bit of eye and gut in a body like a window pane. They begin life nothing like they end up. And as such, despite their bloodlines, despite their manifest destiny to join the others at a later date, they begin life utterly unwelcome in the silver schools of the fish they will become. They say the Siglafjordur Fire Department was exceptionally well trained in the 1970s and 80s. They had so much to work with. It was a town of timber buildings and timber piers, timber pilings and timber masts. It was a town built out to process something like half of the nation's catch. It hadn't just been full, but packed to bursting, then emptied out, almost hollow. What reason was there for the workers to come if the herring didn't? There were all those people who just didn't come back, all those people who lived there, then fled. When the herring disappeared, so many buildings suddenly lost their purpose. The town was filled with abandoned wrecks. The aging lumber wasn't maintained, would weather and rot. Wind blew through broken windows and gaps in the wall. The metal rusted, joints weakened, roofs collapsed. It was a matter of public safety that the fire department set so many buildings alight, let them burn, let them positively blaze, and then put out the fires they themselves had started. Back then, it was so ugly and dangerous, but it was also something else unsettling. It was our children longing for the time to leave. The old infrastructure had been heroic in scale. Even forsaken, it was too much of the shoreline to escape, too close to the road to ignore, and there was just too much of it left standing to forget, no matter how much of what was left standing kept falling down. Maybe the locals would have gotten used to it, would have learned to live with the disrepair, if it weren't for what it cost people to live among the ruins. It wasn't just the fact of it, a problem with the material world, of the way things splintered and shattered and broke. What it represented was worse. This was a place that could hurt you. Just looking at it, a place that kept triggering the memories of sudden change, of total forfeit, of catastrophic loss. These people lived with not just the setting, but also the symbol of their grief. More than a problem of place, it was a problem of memory, a kind of cognitive dissonance of what it was to inhabit a grand old memory palace and watch it crumble around you. In those decades after the herring disappeared, the town was filled with people who didn't understand why you would want a museum of this place at all, couldn't imagine why anyone would come to hear such a sad story. What would be the point? Schooling fish are thought to live by two rules. Remain close to your neighbors, avoid collisions with your neighbors. I gravitate to the metaphoric value, the generally good advice of stick together and don't be a jerk. But the scientific value of the rules is that they describe how schools react in such stunning, swift coordination, as if a school were not a collection of beings in the first place, but all sum and no parts. The two rules are sometimes modeled spatially as a matter of three zones, represented as expanding spheres, like the pulse of a sound wave traveling. The first circle, surrounding a given fish, represents too close. Think of it like the bubble of personal space in our own society, what's known as the zone of repulsion for fish, the space you want to keep clear or else collision is imminent. The next circle, its radius a little wider, is just right. The proper amount of space to keep everyone in touch, but not touching, close, but not too close. The zone of alignment. The zone of alignment is how you pack a school together in a 5 cubic kilometer grid. It is the distance between you and your dance partner, close enough to read each other, but without stepping on any toes. Beyond that, from the edge of alignment to as far away as a fish can sense, is the zone of attraction. The great fat margin in which one fish, detecting another, will seek to get closer. It's a Goldilocks description of the world. Too close, too far, just right. It suggests a pendulum always pulling us to the center. And don't we want to believe in a kind of gravity ever drawing us into balance, into harmony and efficiency, into a position where we fit and a place where we belong? we not ache for it? Truly, the zone of attraction is such a romantic prospect. Its suggestion that it is enough to sense, to have some small trace of the thing we should draw near to. How tempting to believe that a mere glimpse could guide us, that a flicker might bring us home. But note that there is no name for that farther place, for the zone beyond, for the place past where our senses reach and where most of the world is, most of the time. I know, those of you that are worried, it gets better. They build a museum, they find their self-respect, they can remember who they were. It just takes them a while. It's lovely. You should go visit it. They have a great chocolatier. Everything's working out now. But it was.
Did you say they have a great chocolatier? Is that what you said?
Jenny, say it again.
Did you say they have a great chocolatier?
Yeah. There's an artist who thought, you know what? I could go train in Belgium for a while, and then Frida came back and made a a chocolate shop as part of her gallery.
Wow. Okay. So I imagine that there's any number of beautiful trivia that come along with the essays in this collection. And that was so beautiful, especially at the end. Yeah, like Polly says, schooling and shoaling, not having a name for a further place outside of the zone of repulsion, the zone of alignment, and the zone of attraction. That's a gorgeous metaphor for
You
everything.
can imagine the months when I was writing this essay, right? If I went to like a reading or saw friends and people asked how I was, I'd be like, I want to tell you about herring. And they're like, do you? Like, I definitely do. It's gonna blow your mind.
I want to tell you about herring. It's a tough conversation after. But that was lovely. I wonder if you would be so kind as to lead our audience through the conception and actualization of this collection of essays about Icelandic museums.
Yeah. So I always feel like this is the place where I need to express my debt to specifically the Stanley family, who set up a travel grant while I was in grad school, but in general to people that have the foresight to believe that artists should be given money to figure out what could happen. Right? I knew this travel grant existed when I arrived at graduate school, and I was running out of chances to apply for it. And I feel like if I just stopped and gave you all 3 minutes to write up a proposal to leave the country for at least 1 month, and you'd have the money to do it, you could write proposals that would get funded right now. That there are places that we need to be, there are stories we need to hear, there are things we need to witness, there's stuff we need to find out. But I don't know, I hadn't found something that I could put my name on, right? Like there wasn't a thing I believed in. And thank goodness we complained to our friends, and thank goodness they have Google and send us the first search result from World and Museum. And one top 10 list of wacky museums later, you notice something that I would never have clicked on the Icelandic Mythological Museum had I not met exactly one Icelander in my life. In my sister's kitchen in Oakland, trying to smooth out the IKEA diagrams to install her kitchen cabinets. She had this friend from work, and I said, hey, Gardar, we're going to be here for a couple of hours, and it'd be nice to get to know you. I hear you're Icelandic, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I know nothing about your country. What would you say I should know? And let's just pause to think about all the things he could have mentioned, right? Jenny, you've already alluded to the trivium upon trivium that we could just spend the rest of the evening on. He didn't mention this profound literacy. He didn't mention the Arctic Circle. He didn't mention that they have an island that has so few people that birds outnumber them 1,000 to 1, that is famous for its chess matches, and allegedly, occasionally, if you lost a match, you would leap from the cliff because honor dictates that. But more easy to document is the fact that if you have an island of 100 people, one fishing boat goes down, you have lost half the men in town. There's a lot he could talk about. His name is Gardar. He could have talked about Gardar's homie, right? Like Gardar, the Swedish Viking who came by and named Iceland until he decided, you know what, 4 years is enough, we're going to sail on. There's just no end of things he could have said, but the one thing he told me was, we have a penis museum. Which was enough to click on a link several years later. And the link was in Icelandic, and I thought, all right, well, that's easy. You're never going to find out about this. But checked to see if there was a button where I could find another language. And it turned out I could. There were 7 languages on which you can view the Icelandic Mythological Museum's website, one of which is Esperanto. And I just sort of fell down the rabbit hole from there, right? This was the first glimpse I
Really?
had.
Esperanto?
I kid you not. As the founder of the Icelandic Mythological Museum says, we have our official languages are Icelandic, which nobody speaks, and Esperanto, which nobody speaks, but everyone should.
Oh man, that's amazing. Okay, please
Right,
continue.
but this is the hint, right? This is like the first glimpse of the fact that it's a museum about language, which shouldn't have been a surprise to me, right? I started writing about museums because I worked in them, because I watched how for storytelling institutions, we didn't listen, pay attention to, bother to collect, pay any heed or mind to the ones we generated. And boy, were we gonna generate stories. Are you kidding me? Right, museums have already filtered for interesting, relevant, right, crucial touchstones, right? Low-hanging fruit right there. But then they are places that serve a public. And if you interact with the public, things were going to happen, right? I led a print viewing that involved a high school student tipping forward off her little like folding chair and throwing up on something that I pulled from the vault with my gloved hands not an hour before. I can't tell you the museum that has what is functionally a canyon if you open up the loading dock and have the registrar's office open at the same time, but it will create a draft that could lift the painting you're holding out of your hands on a draft of air and impale it on the horn of a Picasso. I can't tell you where that is because museums actually don't want us to know that they have stories. They aren't just too busy, they aren't just forgetting. It's important, right? There's a lot of work they can do as an institution with an institutional facade. But that's no service to any of us.
I'm going to have a question here. Why is it that museums don't want us to know that they have stories to tell?
And this took me more than like 15 years to figure out. I always thought that we were just busy doing stuff, right? I'd be on a collection manager's listserv and someone would say, we found some munitions in the collection. But what are the best practices on that? And they'd get this very sober conversation about, well, like, are you talking about ammo or the hand grenade guides over here? Hey, does anyone remember that one natural history museum where the fluid in their wet specimens of whale ovaries was going bad and they had to take them all up into the parking lot and the Canadian bomb squad exploded them? Like, just not batting an eye. And of course, right, like entropy is going to win. It's a quixotic, heartbreaking thing to try to hold on to anything. And that's what
isn't the purpose of a museum to tell a story? And we have a question from the audience also.
It is, right? But they don't elevate their own stories, right? The ones that they're generating because we are human beings interacting with the physical world, right? Because these are loci of ideas and value, and where that rubs up against the physical, weird stuff was going to happen. Telling stuff, interesting stuff, revealing stuff was going to happen.
Riley, I'm trying to figure out how to.
We're coming, Riley.
Oh man, anybody else who's a co-host here, please help me out. I'm trying to have Riley be able to talk.
Oh, yeah, I can talk.
Riley, talking is permitted.
It's such a weird designation, isn't it? Okay, Riley, what do you got?
What's your favorite thing about Iceland?
Riley, I always feel like somebody's cornered me and asked me to tell them whose child is my favorite, and I understand parents never do that. Favorite fact about Iceland, I almost want to warm up on that and come back to you, or just keep giving you some facts about Iceland as we go along. I mean, this language of it really is striking to me. The fact that you don't have sort of the traditional material stuff that we associate with cultural production, right? You have, there's a lively debate on whether there have ever been trees in Iceland, or whether there were, but then the first settlers burned them all for their saunas before they realized they had geothermal heat right under their feet. So you don't have wood, except if it comes to you from Siberia in the form of driftwood. 70% of wooden things in Iceland for a long time are made from driftwood. The rest of it is from shipwreck. Those are your options, which means you can't afford to burn this, even if you had any workable metal or clay, which you don't really. You are a place that can grow sheep, and farmers in the winter, then they become fishermen, right? You do it when the weather is too bad to farm, you fish in the North Atlantic, right? In the cusp of the Arctic. That's a place where you're at. So if you think about how much energy you have that is going into survival, to how precious the material world is, what's left to you for cultural production is going to be immaterial. You're going to be some of the best storytellers in the world, because that's where you put your energy. I think that's a fun fact, but Riley, can I give you another one? Can I give you a bonus fun fact?
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's this, this is I think my favorite thing that the copy editor wanted to fact check. And there's an article, we can get it all pulled up if we have to. The idea that the thing that changes Iceland is the rubber boot. That right, Iceland is right a colony of Denmark, right? It is an impoverished place, as right. It's hard being a colony. History teaches us that. But then World War II arrives, the British land, the Americans come in, where there's money, there's influence, things are happening, and the Icelanders meet the rubber boot. Imagine going 1,000 years with wet feet, right? That you can spare so little. The traditional footwear of Iceland, they look like slippers. They're beautiful, made of fish skin or seal skin, but you're walking the volcanic earth, and it just slices everything to tatters. You are living in a time where your journeys are measured in units of how many pairs of shoes it will take you to get somewhere. And then you meet the rubber boot. Fishermen come home with dry toes. They say that it is such a shock, right? Such a change in worldview, that there are some Icelanders who add a little bit of water into the boot so it doesn't feel so weird. These are people that are still alive, right? People that were born as citizens of Denmark are still Icelanders now. An awful lot has changed really suddenly. This is a place that you can't drive around the whole island until, I believe, 1974, maybe 1972. There just aren't enough bridges to do it. Right? Imagine, right, getting supermarkets for the first time in the 1960s, apartment blocks, radio, right? People not much older than me will remember the days the radio took off every week. I forget if it's Wednesday and Sunday, but there just wasn't radio because, people should have days off. Riley, I'm sorry, it was impossible to limit myself to just one. I'm going to try to stop there.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I've actually always wanted to go to Iceland, so.
I'm always impressed. I was not a person that gave a single thought to Iceland until I met my sister's coworker in her kitchen floor, and then I saw an internet list. And boy, you people that already know, you're onto something. No shortage of good reasons to go to see, to be part of that particular landscape and that particular culture. Was that the lone
Kendra.
question? Are there more coming? They're super welcome if nobody has mentioned that so far.
Okay, we have one from the Q&A from Claire Walla. Your herring story reminds me of Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder, which is about the Museum of Jurassic Technology.
Yes, it is.
Oh man, I was just talking about this today. This is so cool. This is really, though it's really about the quirky man who runs the museum. In writing about these museums in Iceland, was it important for you to find people or characters through which to tell your stories? Or how often did you allow the museums themselves to be a central character and a piece?
Claire, that's a really thoughtful question. I'm going to have to walk my way around it to see if I actually know the answer. Right, I arrived in Iceland on the theory that there was this one museum. I was going to sit in it for 2 weeks and then travel the country to put it in context. And my working theory was, the thing about the Icelandic Mythological Museum is that it is the best known museum from that country outside of that country. Right, it's been written up in, oh my goodness, right, dozens of countries around the world. It makes all sorts of, wacky, odd, quirky, sadistic headlines and lists. It's well known and it's treated like it's a really weird thing. But if you think of it as a museum, and it is, it's right there in the name. If you look at it from a museum point of view, it's almost traditional, right? It's basically Victorian. It's just not the era of museum you're thinking of now, right? That like the icon on your phone that suggests the old Greek column, encyclopedic collection, giant thing you could never see every part of the collection in one visit in, right? Somehow that's what we've come to think of as museum. And that's the anomaly. Historically, that's a weird thing to happen. The Cabinet of Curiosity, the Cabinet of Wonder, that's so much older. Even the Athenaeum, which we never talk about now, these places where sort of a town puts like a bunch of people put their best thing in one central place, right? Sort of like a library where you can't take anything out. Right, these are the older ideas. So I went to see if there was one museum that might make an essay. And a couple of years later, I had to go back because I had this theory there was a book. And that second trip, I came back convinced there was, but I didn't know what book it was, right? I had to like sort of keep puzzling it out and visit a few more times to sort of sort it out and then finalize it, but fill in the details. So I'm governed mostly by the question of why are there so many museums here? Why are they so good and why are they so recent? So right, that first trip, when I had 2 weeks to put the museum in context, which was, you should have permission. It was right, like the last chapter in the last, it's a cabinet. The last thing in the book is from that very first trip when I thought, well, I would never normally pay to go whale watching, but it will put this museum in context. And it's one of my favorite essays in the book that I had the permission to go see what might be out there. And I noticed, I went to like another 20 museums and none of them had been founded any earlier than 1995 and most of them since 2000. And mind you, this was in 2011, right? All of these museums had happened and really recently, Iceland goes 80 years between the first museum and the second, and that second one is comes just after World War II. From 2 museums in Iceland, right when my mother was born, to now we're approaching 300. And most of that is in the last 20 years. So I was trying to figure out, right, that was sort of my guiding question. And I was lucky that I had access to almost all the people I needed. There's one founder who was alive. The last year she was alive was the first year I went to Iceland. but her family, generations of her family still run the place. Otherwise, you could still catch them, right? This generation is still there. We're on the edge. We're going to start losing more and more of them. But you could find the people that had started all these things. I think the museum is usually the character, not the people who brought it into being. But obviously, right, you need to know them too. And it's a little easier in the beginning, right, with the collector, with this ability to find the one. But the sort of the second half of the book, the three, we can talk about three collectors, but there's really sort of these four other places that wanted to be museums. And they had to figure out what kind of museums, right? You had a small collective of people that knew they wanted something for their town. And the answer was a museum. I was gonna say, does anyone else want to try a really good question I might not actually answer?
I can't help but piggyback on that and ask you, how do you define museum? What makes a museum?
This is really fascinating. So it would be handy for a person like me to be able to put a count on the number of museums in Iceland. And I've been at this for years. It is wildly difficult, right? Someone's going to get a dissertation on just the question, how many museums are in Iceland? I use a number from the museum studies professor on the island, Sigurður Hafsson. From his 2014 spreadsheet, he'd gotten to 265. Definitely more museums have come in since 2014. And one of the things that struck me this first trip, right, these sort of central set of observations and questions that Ben kept sending me back, was the fact that I just never seen anything like it, right? These private collections becoming public museums, right? Like the border there, it was just, it's like it didn't exist. It was so permissive, so permeable. And I couldn't figure it out, right? How this had happened. And at some point, as I was leaving on the second trip, someone explained to me the language well enough to understand that the Icelandic word sap, S-A-F-N, it's a word that you will run into. It's part of the word for library, right? So a collection of books, not a library of books, or not a museum of books. It's a word you could use to describe, say, a group of sheep. The word for collection and the word for museum are the same in the language. Of course, it was easy for one thing to become the other because they had always been the same. So part of what's fascinating is how many of these places become museums because they come into English. The exhibition of Icelandic sorcery and witchcraft really tried to stick to that translation, and they got all sorts of weird phone calls and people wouldn't write them up with the translated name they'd chosen. They would make it a museum in the writing. And people would hear exhibition, they would think it was temporary and maybe it had gone away, when in fact it is a place that is open, I believe, every day of the year. I think you can go on Christmas Day to what now translates commonly as the Icelandic Museum of Sorcery and Witchcraft. So part of this is a thing that we Anglophones have been doing to Iceland, right? We are not respecting their centers and their exhibitions. We want these things to be a museum. And I think it's telling. I don't think it's lazy or bad translation. I think it's tapping into how much more necessary to you is the museum of prophecy than the exhibition of prophecy. But all that said, I have a pretty broad umbrella of museum.
What do you think is the difference between those two things? The museum of prophecy versus the exhibition of prophecy?
I think that museum centers us on objects really often. And so to have museums of things that you can't see, museums of stuff, or museums of things that they couldn't show you the thing that they're talking about, creates a sort of, I don't know, titillation almost. What could that even be? A museum of prophecy? How would you pull that off? I mean, there's a museum of sea monsters. What were they going to show you? Except that this is a place, the Icelandic Center is how it would properly translate, but in English, we always bring it in as museum. The Sea Monster Museum functionally has the stuff of a local history museum, a maritime history museum, a nautical museum, a natural history museum, where they have stuff. But what they are is an oral history museum. They have 4,000 stories. They have a newscaster, among others, but Thorvald Friedrichsen, I just love this project. Iceland is inhabited totally around the edges, right? Sheep sometimes live in the highlands, people don't. And so you can work the map, just the perimeter, in your off hours at the radio station and call every retirement home and see if anyone has a monster story. And as often as not, someone does. This is interesting, right? They say that the old people, they tell the sea monster stories because you have to get old enough not to care what people think about you.
Well, sea monster stories we heard before are bad form, right?
Strangely taboo. Yeah, one of the founders of the Sea Monster Museum, his dad is quoted as saying, "Arnar, monsters are BS, but everyone's seen a ghost."
Have you ever seen a ghost in Iceland?
I have to think about this. I have not. But somehow the asking of the question makes me think about one of my favorite things in Iceland, which is a little church on an island. You can stop over on the ferry if you want to on the western coast. Tiny little place that has a little church that has a painting up in the nave of Jesus wearing an Icelandic sweater.
What?
It's beautiful.
Like it has the Icelandic flag on the sweater that Jesus is wearing? Like,
so clearly you want to talk Icelandic sweaters. I'm glad you asked, Jenny.
I do want to talk Icelandic sweaters.
Well, iconic Icelandic fashion obviously is interesting for all the reasons. We aren't counting Björk's swan dress in this conversation. We are thinking about the national dress of Iceland, where we know the person who made it up about 100 years ago. Like we know the name of the designer that said, we're going to have a costume. Women are going to have these great hats. It's going to be a thing. Icelandic sweater patterns are treated, or they're discussed. They're on offer to tourists as though they have always been the thing that we made, right? The way that you think about maybe right, like Irish sweater patterns. Do you know this about Irish sweater patterns where they're made for the fishermen because they go out and it's so cold and they need good sweaters, and boy, are they good sweaters. But the pattern in them helps identify you in case your body is washed out to sea. The Icelanders don't do that. They have a different thing going on, but most of the patterns, we can date them, I think, from the 60s, right? There's a very clear point where the traditional Icelandic sweaters, they're established, and they get reinforced after the Icelandic banking crash as this, like, something to do with your hands, with your despair. You make some sweaters. And if you note now, every Icelandic bank that had to rebrand after they destroyed the economy, they came back, this is very clever, they came back and their logos are all Icelandic sweater pattern designs. You know, because they're homegrown and cozy and would never hurt you. Sweaters don't hurt people.
That's beautiful. So we have a question from YouTube. What Icelandic souvenirs have you had a chance to take back to the United States other than those ghost rocks?
This is my favorite. We were talking about the Icelandic Sea Monster Museum. This is from their gift store. There's a woman in town who used to. I think we should start a letter writing campaign. Seriously, you have a little bit of time on your hands. Write to the Sea Monster Museum in Bíldudalur. There's only one. If you just wrote Sea Monster Museum Iceland, it would get there. It would definitely get there. And let's ask this woman to make more knit sea monsters. The museum focuses on 4 of the Icelandic Sea Monsters. This is a representation of the Shorlathi. This is one of the founders of the museum. This is his representation of the Shorlathi that are described sort of variously, essentially about the size of a sheep. Sometimes the point of them is that they're very slow. Sometimes the point is that they run as fast as a dog, but mostly you can outrun them, or you can vault over them, or like you can leap over the Shorlathi. And the thing it is trying to do, it is trying to nudge you into the sea. That is its mode of attack. That is the fearsome thing it does. It nudges you. We have no stories of people getting nudged into the sea, just encounters with the Shorlathi and you run away. And I love it, right? It sounds so benign and off-brand for sea monsters. But the more you think about it, if monsters are describing the things that frighten us, that should terrify us, think of all the things that we slowly get accustomed to, that by degree, right, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but takes us ever towards a thing that could kill us. I think
So that leads me into something I wanted to ask you about. If we can allow it here, is a big question, but a lot of your writing explores the intersection between mythology and exhibition, I would say, mythology and exhibition. And that doesn't seem to be quite a 90-degree angle. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what infuses the mythological impetus for the things that you are interested in as a writer.
Redirect me if I answer this wrong. I think I'm interested in things that we hold on to, right? So that's the physical material world, but it's also the ideal world, right? What are the stories that let us survive? What are the things that illuminate and expand and help us find our way? So the stories that we carry really matter, right? Are really interesting. I can't tell you how much nonfiction I slip in under "they say," because I cannot fact check it beyond that, and because I don't really, well, I was gonna say, I don't really care if sea monsters exist. I do. I would love to know, but that's not what the interest in these stories does not hinge on whether or not the stories are relating information that is true. The fact that the story exists itself already tells us so much, right? Is already so stunning and revealing as it is. And right, the mythology, right? All these old ways of story, they're carrying things that must matter, right? We keep coming back to them. We keep passing them on. We keep making sure other people have access to them. And that seems like something worth paying attention to.
I love that idea of things that must matter.
Yes. I should mention that if you want a short reading to collect your thoughts for the final set of questions, we could do that. We could go straight to questions. We could let Jenny continue to dazzle us with her charm and good hosting.
Just interrogate you. We do have one more question here. Looks like in the Q&A. Somewhat random question, but is there a reason why they would nudge people into the sea for their mode of attack? So this must be the sea monster there. Does this lore correlate to any modernized myth elsewhere? They sort of look like the, quote, rodents of unusual size from Princess Bride. Do myths and lore have a large impact in Iceland, like in many other cultures and countries?
I'm glad that this is one place where I can look at it and make sure I'm not leaving things out. I've never heard the explanation on the mode of attack. My personal theory, based on nothing but gut instinct, is that you might need a sea monster to explain to a child why their father doesn't come home. And it's a pretty manageable creature, right? It's a pretty manageable thing that it's doing. I think it could be a placeholder if you needed one to explain why someone was lost at sea. Is my guess. I don't know. They're generally, I don't know, they're portrayed as sort of, I don't know, lumbering and non-threatening. There's a certain amount of sea monster stories that are about, I don't know, stuff that washes up on the beach. The idea of, right, the shore laddie might have sired the lamb that doesn't look like the other lambs, that wasn't viable, that has a, right, a trunk for a nose or something. I leave it to somebody who has a better folklore background than I do. I would love to know what the relatives of the Florlathi are. And interesting that we give it the shore laddie is how we transliterate that.
How much reading do you do in advance of each of these essays that you produce?
I do a lot more listening in some sense, right? A lot of what I want to follow is not well documented. So, right, that's, if it's hard to follow up on, I'm fascinated. So there are things like, I don't know where you would read about the napkin collections of Iceland if you don't read the piece I wrote for Atlas Obscura. I just don't know where it's going to come up. And this was after, right, like sort of the first trip or two, and I thought, right, like I've had an epiphany, I've seen something. I know the steps that happen on enough of these museums, right, what it means for a collector to pretty inadvertently start a collection. And then, I don't know, like some like extended family sees it, like friends in town, people start bringing their friends or visitors, somebody writes something in the paper, like this, like the degrees by which the private collection becomes public. I felt like it was so traceable, right, predictable, that surely I could spot the next one coming. That if I just asked enough Icelanders, right, describe this pattern and said, like, you've got a hometown. Does this ring a bell? Like, have you seen the piece in the paper? Is there a thing you would take me if we were there? And I spent 2 months in Iceland asking basically every Icelander it seemed appropriate to stop for long enough to have this conversation. And no one could point me to another one, right? That there was nothing else that seemed to be on the cusp of becoming. Until, with the exception of the napkin collection, like paper napkins, it was a thing. And it says so much. I'm hoping more people we should write letters to. There are multiple women in Iceland who have paper napkin collections in the thousands of napkins. And they tell you all sorts of things, right? Any one object has like 6 stories in it. It's like very like Aristotelian causes, right? If you look at the napkin collections, we can see a nation becoming wealthy enough to have disposable things. That's big. You've got the specialty napkins printed with baptismal records and weddings, right? It's like an alternate church ledger in napkin form, right? A history of graphic design and how broadly Icelanders are traveling based on what airline napkins and foreign napkins they're bringing in. But it also tells you about this period of time where the women usually describe it as we were bored. There wasn't a lot to do. A thing you could do is, it's sort of like trick-or-treating, right? You would go to a household after an event and you would see if they had any napkins left, and you'd sort of trade them baseball card like with your friends, so everyone would right, have an assortment. That was a thing that a bunch of mostly little girls did and remembered in a way that they knew the people in their town. Don't you want to go to that museum? And like I say, I don't think it's a matter of me having better Icelandic. I don't know that you could find the record of this story if you didn't get sent to someone's kitchen.
That's so cool. That's really cool. Okay, so we have a question from Carling. I'm going to read it out from the chat here. Hi, Giant Museum Nerd here. Love a giant museum nerd for sure. I minored in museum studies at a very interesting time, graduated during COVID. So much of my projects ended up being online exhibitions. What do you think of online museums? How does museum storytelling change in an online space? Do you see similarities between your essays and exhibition writing? As a writer, what do you think of text heavy exhibitions? You would get along with, it is parenthetical, you would get along with my prof, John Bodinger at Susquehanna University.
Uh,
Few questions embedded in there.
Carling, clearly introduce me to John. That sounds delightful.
Right?
Let me see if I can't find my way through some of these questions. I'm going to go backwards. What do I think about text-heavy exhibitions? So I used to manage the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. This is sort of like my home grounding museum. I started as a preparator and eventually, right, had the keys to the vault. And I would give print viewings. It was one of the big times I would interact with a lot of educators who were photographers in town who taught photography classes. And it wasn't just them, it was lots of people, but it would come up, we'd sort of be like after the print viewing chatting. And these were people that knew that I was writing, period, and writing museum text. Not a lot, but some. I did a ton of research and writing for our website. And they would just sort of casually mention that, you know, I never read the text. Like a total like point of pride. And there's sort of the spectrum of, right, I never read the text for right, like this pure experience of the object. And there are I look at everything and then I do a second loop and read the text. People, right, there are all of these gradations of how we navigate the context and the object. And I should say that I'm a big believer in you should use a museum in any way you want. I'm not here to prescribe one way to do it. You should find something interesting and get something out of it. Done. Good job. Good use of your time. Do that. But I will say I've never met the person who says, you know, I go to the museum and I don't look at the objects. I only read the text. I think they must exist. Please direct them to me. I've been looking for them for 15 years. We don't talk about those people. And I think that's partly because, right, there's this question of the object versus context, right? How much context do you need? But there's also the language of museums is really a particular kind of language. There's a model of a mosquito in the basement of the Natural History in New York City, like this nice big mosquito, and it's the only model I've ever seen that had an attribution. We don't talk about the people that make these things. We don't talk about the people that interpret. Maybe the curator in the Blockbuster exhibition signs that opening statement, right? It is text that is unauthored. That's interesting. And then it's text that's trying to do kind of this impossible thing, right? It is, especially in art museums, where the thing is already the best expression of whatever it was expressing. That's right, de facto, right? Which means the language does weird, unusual things in trying to get at something that is beyond language. But there are all these beautiful contradictions, right? These phrases of things that couldn't be, but that's the closest approximation for how the language is going to talk about something beyond words. So I'm a huge fan of text in museums, partly because of the weird, uniquely museumy, or weird, unique things that it does pretty much only in museums. I think we should pay a lot of attention to how language works in museums. I definitely noticed early on that I was apparently writing a collection about collections, and there had to be a way to leverage that. I'm not sure what it is though. But what I did figure out is if you think, well, partly I think about writing sort of as hosting. And I think you can sort of read the way I write as a kind of docenting. I don't spend a lot of time pointing to myself unless you need to know me to help you see something else better. There are a lot of things I want to point to. I spent a lot of time anxious about writing is a time-based medium that creates one linear path through the text, and that is so untrue to how we actually experience anything. I don't need a cause and effect. There's not a hierarchy. I sort of need you to know 12 different things all at the same time, because each one is going to change how you see the other thing and cause them all to ring at the same time in one frequency. But what I have to work with is a page. And it's writing that uses a lot of section breaks. And I think about that more and more as the way you work a gallery, right? That you don't necessarily have to do the perimeter, right? You can find the pieces and then find what connects them, that I'm sort of setting you in a space and giving you a thing to pay attention to, and then another place to attend, and then another place to attend. And hopefully, that culminates and leaves you with something else. Online museums, boy, do they have their work cut out for them. It should work. They're storytelling institutions. We can tell stories with the internet. I believe so much of the object is, it's a touchstone. It is the opportunity to tell a story. An image you would think could do that a lot of the time. But I still notice that the museums that started out as online museums, that have to be online museums, there's a collection of computer viruses, so that you can simulate, you can actually see what those things are without damaging yourself. They're a place that know what they're doing because they started in the medium to begin with, and they didn't get caught up, they didn't get hung up in trying to translate a thing, right? They were using the medium to its utmost to start with.
I can't help but hammer away at the same question I asked you a minute ago. What's a museum?
Working definitions.
I am so sorry, but I can't not know what your thoughts are on this. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and my next project, I'm thinking sort of about collecting institutions, so libraries, archives, museums, which is different. I mean, partly that's an expansion, but also a contracting, right? But I'm thinking about the collecting. And I think museums, for me, it just keeps coming back. They are storytelling institutions. So I'm a person that gets downright heady when I think about a place like the Sea Monster Museum. They can't have objects. They don't have objects, but they are the most amazing things. How have you never heard of an oral history museum? What else would you go to if you knew they were there for the taking? And I've spent years having these conversations with Icelandic museum professionals. Icelandic museum professionals will have you know that there are, it was 45 and 44, I think we might be at 43 now, accredited museums in Iceland. Note that it's a number that's actually shrinking. That's the number of museums in Iceland by the book, right? By the professional standards of we've checked on you.
Why is it shrinking?
It's hard to have a museum. In some sense, it's not shrinking because every accredited museum in Iceland is a part of the National Museum, what the Icelanders will refer to as the mothership. Which means that if in your tiny town of Dalvik, if that museum ever can't sustain itself, it just runs out of the personnel, the funding, the building gets blown away, they've had some really bad winds historically. If something happens, the mothership can absorb the collection, which if you think of yourself as a person who's in the business of constantly being afraid that you can't do the fundamental thing that you're setting out to do, which is to hold on, you would think that that would sound super comforting, that right, someone's got your back, don't worry, if anything happens to me, the kids will be fine, they're just gonna go live with grandma. And no one, I've never met anyone who treats it that way, right? That, right, to be a small staff, sometimes a staff of one in a small museum, is to have a very personal connection, right? To have to be driven by a certain kind of dedication. And the idea of someone else could come in and take your stuff is no comfort. there are museums that could be accredited that have never bothered to jump through the hoops to get accredited. Technically, I've checked on this. The Phonological Museum could apply and be accredited. It is a comparative anatomy museum, right? This is old science. This is Darwin. This is Huxley. This is Cuvier. They just don't want to invest their time that way. They're doing fine, and they don't want their collection to ever go to someone, or they don't want to lose control over it. So we start out with the narrow sense of how many museums there are in Iceland. I take this broader view, and I get excited, right? I start talking to people about, but what do you think in this sudden bloom of museums, all of these places so fast, right? All of these sort of collections became public, and then we're moving on to this whole other thing of museums that are about the story they need to tell. They aren't even being held back by needing objects. What are we watching? What is that evolution taking us toward? What is the pure story, nimble institution? And sometimes you meet the awesome woman in Hafnarfjordur who's like, well, why do museums even need to last at all? What if Bjork had a museum for as long as Bjork's alive, and we'd have a flag up like Dollywood, and we take it down, and it would be sort of like a pop-up museum that would only exist while we need it and not have to exist after that. But mostly you don't need the cool woman in Hafnarfjordur. You meet the person that looks at you and says, that's not a museum. If we're not bound to a thing, and I worry that that I simplify this in my thinking, that I'm missing nuance, partly because it's easy to relate, to understand that if you've spent a lifetime, if you've spent generations, if you were professionally trained to hold on to things, if you are always thinking about the budget of what it's going to cost to keep the temperature and humidity right, to pay for storage, to make new exhibitions, to fix the thing that falls down. The idea that there are people that can do what you do without doing all of that, I don't know how you would fathom that.
Man, oh man, oh man. Okay, that was an excellent answer to that question. Are we trying to get out of here at 9? Is that the goal? Okay. So
don't
let
look
me.
at me. I will hang out with you all night. You want to be disciplined. You want to respect the people that are here. You are in charge. Sheepdog is Jenny.
And I will note that Kendra has subverted the non-pandemic visiting writer paradigm and is coming to us from Central Time. So she is a couple of hours ahead of us. Do we have any questions for Kendra in the Q&A or in the chat? Anything people want to ask about Iceland or about this type of a saying, or about her personal journey as an author?
How do you
Anything
sneak
like that?
drawings into a work of nonfiction?
How do you sneak drawings into a work of nonfiction? It's a really good question, actually.
You.
Because like if you see Kendra's book, it also incorporates Kendra's drawings, and it is printed in blue, and like this is very super unusual.
I'm trying to figure out the shortest, most compressed version of the story. We might not get there. The first thing that I found in my life that I thought maybe this is the thing, it's not the thing, but it's the closest that I've come to, was photography. And I went off to Korea with this Fulbright where I was teaching English and working on a creative project, and the photographs were just impossible. It was terrible. I never felt like I had permission, that I could be sure that it was okay to make pictures, and they had authority, right? Like it looks like a document, and boy, did I never have authority in Korea. Korea always felt like hearsay, right? It could delight me, it could charm me, it could surprise me. But I would ask somebody the next day in the same room, what was that amazing thing you told me? I just wanted to confirm. And they would ask me, where did you hear that? So I was writing these letters home, and they started evolving into these essays. And I figured out there was a word for what I was doing, and ended up in grad school and started bookbinding. The same semester I started formally studying the essay. And I thought, bookbinding, that's it. I'm a structure person. This is it. I love texture. Everything about this is great. It rewards experiment, right? These small controlled decisions that affect things. This is it. And the bookbinders are like, yeah, well, maybe you should print things so that you have stuff to bind. I was like, okay. And then I found letterpress. So I want to show you the first thing I ever printed in letterpress of a book length. This is Love is in the Airport. I wanted to print my own writing, so I chose the shortest thing I'd ever written because it was going to have to be set, every character by me in lead type. So I had not been drawing, but I've made these drawings, what Sarah Langworthy at the time called stick figures who've had a snack. And I was drawing in a style that would be easy to print, right? So not halftone, right? It's the line. It is prints the color of the ink, or it doesn't, or it's the color of the paper. And this was a revelation to me that the images could do something that the text wasn't, right? That this is about meeting a human being. That's me. That's love. And what it means if you meet love and he asks for your number and you don't give it to him. The text by itself was never a good essay, right? It had, I don't know, too much work to do, but once I had the image that could tell the literal story and the text could just worry about the metaphoric implications of it, hoo boy, I was off to the races. And the first, I think it's the first, one of the early conversations I ever had with my editor at Penguin, John Siciliano normally does Penguin Classics, he does works in translation. I'm kind of a special case for him. And he said, do you have thoughts on trim size? And I did. I had a lot of thoughts on trim size and margins and small caps and half titles and front matter and back matter. And I said, John, I'm just going to send you some things. And you can, like, I've made some books. Let me send them to you so you have a sense of how I'm thinking about books as objects. And I'd always thought that the books should have illustrations. In 2015, Anomalous Press started letting me make these chapbooks, one a year, the first 3 essays in the book. These little things that the first edition have letterpress covers. They're tactile and delicious. Oh my goodness, Lee Marshallonis made a woodcut that wraps around. What? Because they're too thin to print anything on the spine. Annie Nilsson was illustrating the first 2, Fozia Karimi, who just added to your list. I'm not going to pull it out because I'll, no, I will pull it out. You deserve that. Dun, dun, dun. It's her bird drawing you've been looking at here. That is her, a broadside from this book, Above Us, the Milky Way. If you want someone who knows their text and image, she's got me beat to aces. Oh my goodness. I'm going to hold this up a little bit longer because you want it in your life. But this is I've had writers illustrating my work and I loved it. It was the best thing ever for another artist to come in and interpret, right? To make the decisions for me. I couldn't illustrate my book because I was illustrating Drown Sever Sing, a friend's book. And I started asking writers and they were able to do it. And because of these little chapbooks with a tiny press where anytime I said, hey, could we have a map? They'd say, sure. Are you going to make a map? Anything I could do, I could have. And so I started to be able to imagine the Icelandic project as a thing that had fancy end papers and maps and illustrations. And I remember it was in September, about a year ago, that my editor called. He said, I've been thinking about the illustrations. I think you should do them, which had never dawned on me. He said, I've been thinking about, this is a book about traveling in Croatia, which is mostly made for the love of making, let me find a good one for you, pressure prints, right? These lovely, hazy, it's a not really common style of printmaking. It's a super thirsty, absorbs the ink kind of thing to do. Look at these fish. John was not thinking of these fish, though he knew about the herring essay. He was thinking about this piece of seaweed on the back cover. And he said, well, couldn't that be an Icelandic piece of seaweed? And I said, no, this is a Mediterranean piece of seaweed. Clearly not. But I've been taking pictures for a long time. And so I started drawing from the pictures that I made. It took a while. He said, great, you should make them. And I want them by the end of the month and no more than 50, please. Yeah, I didn't know how that was going to happen. But it took me 2 weeks to figure out any sort of visual language that was going to make sense. I mean, I was beholden to things like that bird, the possibility of no one had illustrated things the way that I draw, right? I had that in my mind. But then when I realized this sort of, it's like light box language, right? It's fancy tracing. Is it even that fancy? Right there, it's about line. It's a thing I knew would print and make sense in a book. So right, it's the same stick figures with a snack, essentially, except now there are egg cartons in a shed. There are old combs. Trying to see if I can find you one from the reading today. One that almost didn't make it in. It was not legible enough. And I realized I really like the ones that are hard to understand. You probably can't in this little corner figure out that we were looking at the railing of a pier and then the building behind it seen in reflection. That's what it is, though. I was there, I promise. That's what it is. So you have an idea, right? Your editor agreed it should have images, and you figure out how to make the images, and you think about the fact that it's sort of like, it's a lot of flora and fauna, that you're talking about the natural history of this place. You're talking about what is living there while you're writing about all the stuff that becomes static. Right? You're sort of tucking things in like you would press a flower in the pages of a book. You're thinking about the natural history notebooks, right? These people that did the paintings of the stuff as they were venturing out into the world. And I don't know about you, I've always found, I remember a certain period of reading as a child where chapter books, but there would still be illustrations. And I found illustrations super jarring, or like I'd have a vision of who the characters were and then that wasn't right. Or it would show a scene that I hadn't read about yet and sort of spoiled it. So the drawings are frequently, maybe mostly, not literally what's happening, but they're from the space. They're from, right, they're the Arctic poppies that grow in the parking lot of the Museum of Witchcraft. They're doing some stuff.
We have a question. We have a question that is attendant to what you're describing here. What was the process like working with Fawzia Karimi on your book?
Yeah, I should say that I met Fawzia at a reading, like a very salon style thing in a friend's house. I heard her work and saw the images of her family photographs, her illuminations projected above her on a wall before I knew anything about her as a human being. And 2.5 weeks later, I wrote to her to ask if she would illustrate a chapbook. And I think there was about a month to get it done. And she wrote back a very reasonable, detailed list of the reasons why it was not going to happen. And then she explained how she could fix all those things and get it to work. So she points out that they're line drawings. They're just ink. Much easier on the body, much faster to do. She called one day to say, so I've realized there are two kinds of birds. I was trying to make a unified graphic language, and it can't be done because there are bold, graphic, clean line birds. And then, let's see if I can't find the wimbrel. There are squiggly birds. So right, the text was all done. I'd highlighted birds that feature more prominently in the text as a list of things. She picked ones that visually were interesting, and then we made sure that they were placed in the book so that the whimperl has room to run off the page and the tern has room to fly off the page. And we learned about squiggly birds. So it was a dream, and we are hoping to collaborate on more things. We have a couple things in the works. And she points out that if you can get to know someone through their work before you know anything else about them, there couldn't be a better way to know someone.
That's a beautiful note for us to maybe try to wrap up here. Like we've learned something about Kendra through her work here and through what we've heard. And maybe learn something about our own personal journeys. Like I feel like I have. Like the avenues that are open to us are many and varied. Are there any lingering questions from people who
Malingering
are
questions.
here? Malingering, yeah.
I like how many
Or,
different places there are to look for those questions.
I know, right?
Good fielding, team.
Well, I think maybe we should call it to an end. Natalie, do you have something? Yes.
Mainly, I just want to say thanks. This has been such a great evening. Really, really great. And Jenny, thank you too. Beautifully done, everybody. And on my computer, Jenny, that finger was pointing at the chat. And thank you.
Thanks to chat. Yes.
Yeah, that totally works. That totally works.
Nice job, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kendra, and thank you for Greg and Natalie and the faculty for making this happen. But yeah, Kendra,
thank you, generous
awesome.
hosts. Thank you, intrepid question askers. May we have reasons to talk about ghosts and birds and rubber boots again in the future.
Atkins.
Napkins.
I'm telling you, they're
I know, right? Someday, maybe even in person. Let's see. But yes, thank you very much, Kendra, and good night, everybody. I
Good
suppose
night,
we can see this evening a visiting writership.
In the Icelandic. Bless, bless.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Kendra. That was fantastic.
My pleasure. Take care, Luke. Really nice to meet you.
You as well. Thank you.